What we're going to do in here is we're going to start with the ISO dial, which is the sensitivity of the sensor. Over on the left of the camera, we've got our ISO dial, which has a lock release button, which you can press in to lock, and you can press it again and unlock it so you can change it either easily or have it really locked in there. All right, so in here, we have a lot of options. So we have some numbers, we have letters, we have a variety of things going on. So first up, let's just go with A. A is automatic. That is the camera. It's going to look at its exposure meter and it's going to raise and lower the ISO in order to give you a correct exposure. This can be very handy in situations where you want the camera to be very fast and easy to work with and accommodate different lighting scenarios. Now, the exact setup, the way that it looks at the information and the types of adjustments that it can be made, can be adjusted in the ISO auto setting within the shooting settings menu. Let's go ahead and take a quick look in here because this is the setup for it. There are actually 3 different presets that you can have saved for this. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the menu. And over here on the left-hand side, we want to come down to the camera tab and come over to the ISO auto settings. And if you go to the right in here, you'll see that there's auto 1, 2, and 3. So if you have 3 different settings, you can kind of leave it on one and quickly go to the others that are set up the way that you want. To get it set up right, you'll need to go to the right over here, and you can set up the default sensitivity, which I'm going to recommend at 125, but you could set it other things depending on your needs. You could figure out what is the highest sensitivity you want to use. Let's just say you thought 6400 was acceptable. You could press OK there. And the minimum shutter speed, you could set it for a particular shutter speed that it would trigger you going to the next higher ISO. So the way that works is the camera, if it's going to be setting the ISO for you, it's going to look at where your shutter speed is. And as it drips down to lower and lower shutter speeds, at a certain point, it's going to kick the ISO up so that you're at a faster shutter speed. And the question is at what point do you want it to kick in going to a higher ISO? You can choose either a physical shutter speed like this, or you can have it automatic where the camera will look at what lens is on the camera and what focal length it's set at and set a shutter speed appropriate to that for hand holding the camera. And so this can work out very nicely for handheld photography of basic subjects. If you're using it for action subjects, you're going to need to probably want to put in a faster shutter speed that's appropriate to stopping that particular fast action. And we'll talk a bit more about those auto ISOs as we go throughout the class and dive into the menu settings. But that is the auto option when it comes to ISO. All right. 125 is the native or base setting on this particular camera. So if you want to get the optimum image quality, the least amount of noise, the maximum amount of dynamic range, 125 is where you're going to want to have it set. Next, we have our standard ISO range, which goes from 125 up to 12,800. And then we get to C, which is custom, which is where we get to really set a lot of things on our own. We can set either an extra high setting like 25,000 or 51,000. We can also go down to some low settings below 125 all the way down to 64 if we want to pull it down there. Now we generally don't want to use low ISOs because they do lose dynamic range by about a stop. And so you only want to use those if you absolutely need to. You don't want to use the higher ones because you're going to get noise, but I'll show you that here in just a moment. And then you can also move between the different auto settings. So let's say you have an auto ISO set up for street photography, and then you have an auto ISO set up for portrait photography, and then you have an auto ISO set up for action photography. You could quickly switch between those if you want to. So if you want to set the ISO dial to C, what you do is you simply just turn the front dial of the camera. Let me show you that real quickly. So on our ISO dial on the top of the camera, we can turn it to the C mode, and then we will adjust the front dial of the camera. And you can see in blue at the bottom on the camera, we can see our different ISO settings. 125 is the base or native sensitivity. We can go down to the low settings, and we can dial up with these third stop increments all the way up to 51,200. And after that, we have ISO number 1, or auto ISO number 1, number 2, and number 3, depending on how we have those set up in the menu system. So if you don't want to use the physical dial on the camera, which you may not want to do just because it's faster and easier to do by just turning the front dial, you can do so very quickly and easily. Or maybe if this is a little too quick and easy, then you can actually go in and set the actual settings using the dial itself on there. So you do have two different ways that you can be using the ISO settings on here. Now let's take a look at my standard test on ISO. I shoot a stationary subject and then I zoom in really close to see at what point do we see noise and how much noise do we see. Now, this camera has got a very good quality sensor in there. You're not going to notice much noise at these lower ISOs like 125 through 800. You might notice at 1600 if you go in very close on it, but it's typically on these higher settings where you're going to clearly see it. And so if you can't see your screen real clearly, well, it's very noticeable at 25,000 and 51,000. It's still pretty heavy at 12,000, but I'm beginning to find 6400 quite useful and reasonable on this. And so it's noticeable, but it's not terrible at 6400 in my opinion. So it really depends on your usage and how the photos are going to be used as to what the highest setting you want to go to is. But somewhere between 16 and 6400 is probably going to be the range for most people, sometimes wanting to go outside that range, I'm sure. All right, so that is the ISO setting on the camera. Next up is the shutter speed dial, and boy, is there a lot going on in this little dial here. So like the ISO dial, it's got this lock release pin so that you can lock it into a particular shutter speed or setting, or have it free to turn so that it's relatively easy to work with. Now, if you are going to be locking this off, the back dial is also going to be very handy. One problem with the shutter speed dial, and I love shutter speed dials, but a real problem with it, is that if you're trying to be exact about getting your shutter speed setting, you cannot do third stops with that dial turn. It's just too many settings on there for doing it. So what you do is you set it to the nearest shutter speed setting, and you can turn the back dial to get to the third stops. Now, if you do set the shutter speed to T for time, you'll be able to set all your shutter speeds with the back dial on the camera. So let's take a little closer look at the shutter speed dial and all that it has going on. All right, like the ISO dial, it has an A setting for automatic. So if you want your shutter speeds figured out automatically by the camera using its standard light meter, just trying to get you a normal exposure, you can throw it in automatic, and that's going to give you essentially an aperture priority program or a program depending on what else is set automatically on the camera. We then have 8,000th of a second, which is actually 1/8,000. These are all fractions, as I know most of you know, but just reminding some of the newbies, these are actually fractions of a second in here. So we have a nice long list of them. The 250 gets an X beside it because it is the maximum flash synchronization, and oftentimes X will be used for the synchronization speed of a camera, or at least the maximum speed. You can use the camera at slower shutter speeds, but no faster ones. All right, more shutter speeds down here till we get down to 1 second, which should really have the quotations next to it because it's not a fraction. It is 1 full second. Now, you can go to the third stops by turning the back dial from a near shutter speed setting. And so you can get to 1/800th of a second in a couple of different ways, depending on what shutter speed you have set. You can go up 1/3 or 2/3, down 1/3 or 2/3. And so if you want a fine-tune setting, just do that with the back dial on the camera. Next up is the T setting. T stands for time, but it's for long and specific shutter speeds. So if you don't like to use the shutter speed dial, you'd rather just use one of the regular command dials on the camera, set it to T, and you can adjust using the back dial on the camera the full range of shutter speeds. And I have done that more times than I would like to admit. I'd like to say I love using the physical dials on the camera, but sometimes it's just a little bit more hassle getting to all those other shutter speeds that I want to be able to get to that are not on the shutter speed dial. So if you want to get down to 15 minutes, you can just dial it down there when you set it to the T mode. And this is quite nice. One of the things I like about Fuji is I think they are the only company that just lets you go from the fastest to the slowest without really a problem in this without turning on any extra modes. And so if you like doing nighttime work, it's just very convenient and easy to work with, just setting it to that T setting. Next up is B. B stands for bulb, which is a long time exposure. You can get up to 60 minutes on it. Now, the way the bulb works is it keeps the shutter open as long as your finger is down on the shutter release. So if you want to leave it down there for 8 seconds, well, you can do it for 8 seconds or 60 minutes. Now, I don't recommend that because when your finger's on the shutter release, that means you're probably moving or vibrating the camera, and that's where a cable release comes in handy. But it works in the same technique. You press in on the cable release and it stays open as long as that cable release is pressed. When you release it, then the shutter closes and the exposure ends, and that can be really handy for long time exposures. Now, the shutter speed dial's top shutter speed is 8,000th of a second, but that is not the top shutter speed in the camera. You can actually go much faster than that, much faster than that. This is the fastest shutter speed I've seen on any consumer camera, up to 180,000th of a second, using the electronic shutter speeds. Now, electronic shutter speeds are something we're going to talk more in depth about in section 5, the drive mode. I'm kind of calling that capture control, how we control the capture and the shutter of the camera itself. And so rather than using the mechanical shutter, it uses the electronic shutter. And this new sensor allows for extremely fast shutter speeds. I think the fastest shutter speed I've seen on any camera, normal consumer photography camera, pro level though, has been 64,000th. And so this has gone up almost 2 full stops from that. Now, there's not a lot of great reason why you're going to need that. There is need for 16,000 and 32,000 when you are using very fast lenses with very bright lights. And so it'll be interesting to see what uses people make of these extremely fast shutter speeds. There's a big caveat, and you really got to watch section 5 to understand how electronic shutter speeds to realize how all this is going to work. But I'll just kind of leave you hanging here for a moment, but you're going to want to check that section out and then maybe come back to this and watch about shutter speeds in here. So changing shutter speeds is a great way of controlling how much your subject is frozen or their motion is shown. 1,000th of a second for an eagle flying around, a second for a river being blurred to get that nice flowing water look. Now, if you want to use bulb, that's going to be great for nighttime, especially light trail shots like this, showing the trails of car lights. This is going to be about a 60-second exposure example here. Now, if you do want to use the bulb mode, you are going to be limited with the electronic shutter. So we'll talk more about switching back and forth between the mechanical and the electronic shutter, but there are a number of limitations when you are using the electronic shutter, and the bulb is definitely one of them. Let's go ahead and take a look at the shutter speed dial on our camera here. So I love the physical dial. It's got a very nice feel to it. If you know you're shooting a particular event and you want a shutter speed like 1,000th of a second, you can lock in that pin and then that dial just will not turn for you, which is great. You can leave it unlocked if you're regularly making changes. If you want to get to some of those fractional shutter speeds, let's see, right now I am set to 2/50th of a second. You can see that in blue on the bottom left. And I can turn the left dial to go from 160, 200, there's our 250, 320, and 400. Now, if I change it down to 125, it immediately goes down to 125, and I can go up to 160 and 200, and I can go down to 180. So those are our third stops. And so whenever you turn the dial, it goes to that specific shutter speed, and then you can adjust, if necessary, those third stops in there. If you set the top dial to T, you can just change your shutter speeds as you want with the back dial of the camera. And so you can see, I'm going to move my aperture out of automatic for right now so that we can see a little bit more about kind of manual control of this. And so for right now, I can see I'm at a 15th of a second, and I can go third stops in either direction. If I want to go really long, it's going to get a little overexposed here. Let's just throw this down here. I can go into full seconds and into minutes if I want to. And so leaving it in T and just adjusting it with the back dial of the camera is, I think, a technique a lot of photographers are going to like, just because it allows them to go between the greatest range of all the different options that are available. Now, let's just talk a little bit more about these shutter speeds. So the mechanical shutter speeds on this camera are going to range from an 8,000th of a second to everything slower. And so this is kind of a standard operation of this particular camera. The electronic shutter speeds can also do a wide range. They're limited on how long they can go, but they can go a little bit faster. And so they can go to that 1632 up to 180,000th of a second. I hesitate putting the camera in electronic shutter for long periods of time just because it conflicts with a lot of other things that you or I may do with the camera. And so it will limit you. And I think the electronic shutter is a great feature. You just want to be specific about when you are using it. As I say, if you leave it on and you go try to turn something else on or off, you might realize that you don't have access to it. And it's because of that electronic shutter. So you want to keep an eye on that particular setting on this particular camera. All right, next up, let's talk about the aperture setting, which is going to be done on the lens in most cases. Most all Fuji lenses have an aperture ring, and you can turn it to whatever aperture setting you think is appropriate for your particular situation. Now, there are a number of lenses, and there are very few that are known as XC lenses. And these are more their inexpensive consumer lenses. And in order to save money, they've taken off the aperture, and that means that you're going to have to use one of the dials on the camera. Most of the lenses will have an R in the name and title of the actual lens to let you know that there is a ring, an aperture ring on that particular lens. Now, there are a couple of different styles of Fuji lenses. They've kind of gone back and forth depending on the style of lens. And there is an automatic setting on these lenses, but it varies whether it's something that you turn the aperture to the A setting after the smallest aperture, or whether there's a flip switch that goes back and forth between manual and aperture. And so take a look at your lenses to keep a notice of what type of automatic setting you have on your lens. But they both operate in the same way. Once you get them into automatic, you don't need to set the aperture. The camera will do that for you, or you can set the aperture yourself. Now, for those lenses that do not have an aperture ring on it, you're going to need to use the back dial on that camera on those XC lenses for controlling the apertures. Apertures, of course, are going to control your depth of field. So if you want lots of depth of field, dial in a small aperture opening, which is actually a big number like 16 or 22 or 32. If you want very shallow depth of field, you want a wide open setting like 1.4 or 2 or something like that. So controlling the apertures is pretty easy, but just be aware there's a few little caveats if you have that XC lens. All right, the shutter release can also be used as a depth of field preview. Now, what a depth of field preview is, well, gives you a preview of what depth of field you're going to have depending on what aperture you have stopped down. So by pressing the shutter release down halfway, you can get yourself a depth of field preview right on screen on the camera. Now, this works a little bit funky on this camera, so there's some things I want to show you about this. So let's get out a focusing target here in front, and I'm going to change my camera to automatic apertures and automatic ISOs right now. And you can see that we have our subject in the background in focus, and in the foreground that's pretty out of focus. But when we press, actually I need to stop down to F22, and now when I press down, you'll see that that subject in the foreground becomes much more in focus, and then it steps back to shallow depth of field. So it stops down when we press down on the shutter release. Now let's go ahead and swing this around so that you can see what's going on in here. And when I press halfway down, you need to add a little bit more light in here so you can see. You can see in there that we are stopping down. Now it kind of opens a little bit on the funny side, kind of slowly, and that's just the way it works when it's in automatic shutter speeds. Now, I don't have a great explanation why, but when you change to a manual shutter speed, it does not do this. So you do not get your depth of field preview. Now what it's doing is it's staying closed down to give you a preview of the depth of field. When you press down on the shutter release, it opens quickly so that the lens and camera can focus, and then it closes back down. But all of this is reversed when you are in manual focus. It then works very precisely. So if you like depth of field preview, Manual focus is fantastic because it shows you exactly what's going on. So as you can see, that's a little bit of a funky setup there on the depth of field preview, but it can be very helpful when you want to use it and you know how it works, and now you know how it works. All right, program auto exposure. Most cameras on the market have something called a mode dial on the top of the camera, is how shutter speeds and apertures are controlled. This camera doesn't have that. Now on that mode dial that most other cameras have is a P setting, which stands for program, which means the camera is going to control shutter speeds and apertures for you. Now this has individual controls over those components, and it doesn't say that it has program, but it has program when you set your shutter speed dial to A and the aperture to A. When you have those orange settings set, you are in the program mode. Now, the ISO is independent and separate, so you can set that manually if you want, or you can set it to automatic, and it's still program. There's no name difference between those. Program auto ISO, program manual ISO. So when you get into doing that, you're going to be able to look in the viewfinder or on the LCD monitor, and you can see what shutter speeds and apertures the camera is setting for you, and or the ISOs if you're having that manually or automatically set, you'll see that. And then if you want to use the exposure compensation, which we're getting to in just a moment, you'll see if that is set over on the left-hand side. And so you can do something called program shift with the back dial, which allows you to adjust the exposure back and forth. I'll do a little demo here in just a moment, but one of the things I want to alert you to is the color of the numbers that you are looking at. And when the numbers are blue, that means you are manually controlling that particular feature. When they're white, they're automatically being controlled. And if they're red, there's a warning that you're kind of out of range and you're probably going to encounter an exposure problem. So let's go ahead and take a look at this in the real world here. So right now we've got the aperture on A, we've got the shutter speed on A, and I have the ISO on A. So everything is completely automatic. And so down here in the back of the camera, you can see that everything is in white here. And so if we press down on the shutter release, we're getting a 52nd of a second. Fuji gets very accurate. F4 at ISO 200. Now, if I want to turn the back dial on this camera, I can choose to shoot with a faster shutter speed, and it's going to compensate by bumping up the ISO. If I want to dial to the left, I could get more depth of field. You can see our f-stop here is changing up to f11, and that has lowered my shutter speed, lowered my ISO as well. Now, if I want to set the ISO myself, let's just set it to 800. That's not bad for here in the studio. I can adjust the program of the shutter speed and aperture here by just turning this dial, and I can either get higher shutter speeds, lower shutter speeds, more depth of field, or less depth of field. Now, if I take the shutter speed off of A and I put it on T, you'll see that the shutter speed has turned blue. And if I do that with the aperture, you can see that it has turned blue as well. Let's try to get this a little bit more normal exposure so we can see things here. And so you can see those are in blue. Now, if I go ahead and set the aperture to A, we've got shutter speeds that we're setting. But if we go to too fast a shutter speed, this lens's maximum aperture is f4.0. And you can see that it's gone orangish red here. I call it probably more orange. It means that it does not have an aperture big enough to shoot at 1/1000th of a second. The camera will allow me to shoot, but if I go ahead and take a look at that photo, we can see that it is an incredibly dark photo here because I set too fast a shutter speed given my ISO and the shutter speed that I wanted. So in order for me to correct for this problem, I need to either lower my shutter speed back down to a normal range, which looks like here around 200th of a second, or I would need to raise my ISO. Let's go up to 1/1000th of a second again. This is where we're getting a really dark photo. If I raise the ISO high enough, I can now shoot a photo here, and that photo is going to come out fine, as we can see here. 1/1000th of a second, f4.5 at 5000 ISO. And so those are some of the controls that we have with that program exposure and some of those colors and manual changing in there. So something you want to play around with to make sure that you're familiar. Not everybody is going to use all the available options when it comes to setting the exposure, but find the ones you like and get good at them. All right, the exposure compensation dial. This is a way for you to get your images a little bit brighter or a little bit darker when you are using the camera in some sort of automated way. It could be auto ISO, it could be auto apertures, it could be auto shutter speeds, any combination, anything where auto is turned on, that's where the exposure compensation dial comes in handy. If you are doing full manual work, you don't need the exposure compensation dial. It doesn't do anything for you. But with something in auto, this allows you to dial in an image that's going to be a little bit darker or a little bit brighter than what the metered reading of the scene is. Normally, the camera wants to give you an even exposure, and this allows you to have something a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, depending on how light or dark your subject is. Now, this goes +3 stops in either direction. But if you turn the dial to the C setting, then the exposure indicator expands out to 5 stops. And so if you want to shoot an extra dark 4 and 5 stops or an extra light 4 and 5 stops, you can do so by setting it to the C setting and adjusting the front dial on the camera. Now, to be honest with you, I don't think I've shot many shots at ±4 or 5 stops, but it can do it. And if you just like making these adjustments with the front dial rather than that physical dial on the top of the camera, well, then you can just use the C setting here. So it's yet another option of where you can use the dial, or you can use one of the command dials front and back on the camera to control those sorts of things. Now, one of the most important things is to reset that when you are done on the camera. So let me take a quick demo with you on this one. So the camera, let's put it into an aperture priority mode, which means the shutter speeds is set automatically. I'm going to leave it on 800 ISO. That's good in here. And now I'm going to set an aperture of, let's go with 5.6 on this particular case here. And so our camera is giving us what it thinks is a normal exposure, and I'd say it's pretty darn close. Now, the white cabinet here that I got my little sample stuff on is a little bit brighter than average, and so I might want to set this to +1/3 or +2/3 to get an actual brightness that matches what it is in reality. I can bump it up to 3 and minus down to 3, and it's obviously very dark. I can put it down to C, and now I can adjust it very quickly and easily with the front dial of my camera here. And so this is a nice, quick, easy way to use everything if you do regularly want to make adjustments, especially those more extreme adjustments. I'm going to go ahead and remember to turn this back down to 0 because that's where you want to leave it in the default position. All right, manual exposure. Well, we've talked about the 3 components, ISO, shutter speeds, and apertures. You should know how to change them. You're going to be looking at the exposure indicator over on the left of the viewfinder or on the back of the camera. This is going to show you how much underexposed or overexposed you are in 1/3 stops or full stops. And generally you want it towards the middle for an even exposure, at least with average brightness subjects. You may want to have it a little above it or a little below it. Now, I love manual exposure because I like shooting several shots of the same subject to get different compositions and different timings and so forth. And this is going to give you consistent results when all of your critical exposure settings are exactly the same. It also works out really well in tricky and unusual lighting situations. And so when the light is unusually bright or dark or just different for some reason, you can really dial in exactly the settings that you want there. And so let's go ahead and show you manual exposure on this camera. So let's go ahead and set an aperture of f8 on the lens. And so we have f8 on the lens. We're going to leave it at 800 ISO. And we're going to take it off of A on the shutter speeds. And as we dial our shutter speed dial, you can see that we're getting closer and closer to the correct exposure. And that looks pretty close. That looks a little too bright. That looks a little too dark. So it's somewhere between 60 and 30th of a second. So I can go to 60 and I can dial down to 40 or 50. And I'm going to say 40 is where I think it's about right. Now, this is just what the image looks like to my eye. The actual exposure indicator is saying that 60th of a second is correct. And I can say that, you know what, I think this is a little bit brighter than average. And so I'm going to go up a third or 2/3 of a stop and call this a proper exposure. And so this is where you get to have some manual control and say into the exact way that your image is going to look. And this is how I usually set up most of my stuff with this camera. I like working with it in a manual fashion just because it gives me more control and more consistency. But I do like throwing it into automatic in situations that are fast changing or where I'm not concerned about getting exact settings. I just want to get the shot and I want it to be close to a reasonable exposure. Put it in aperture priority or shutter priority, and it's going to work out quite well. I prefer aperture priority, so setting the shutter speed dial to A. If I am doing shutter priority, where I am setting the aperture to automatic, there's limited apertures on the lens, and you can run yourself into problems like we were experimenting with earlier. And so something I think works well is setting shutter speeds yourself, having the camera automatically set apertures, but also automatically set ISOs. The camera can then adjust the ISO when you get into darker situations. And so you need to experiment with those different combinations to see what works best for what you do. All right, next up is metering, and this is how the camera reads the light. Now, this is something that can be accessed in the full menu system under the shooting settings called photometry. This is also something that is currently pre-programmed to the top selector button, or so the selector button going up. You press that, and then you can choose the 4 different options in here. So let's take a look at what these options are. So first up is multi. This is 256 segments. This is probably the best general setting to leave your camera in when it comes to reading light. It does very good with bright light, low light, mixed lighting, it measures these in 256 areas, and it kind of really balances out the light with the dark. So it does a very good job in most situations. And this is where most people leave their camera most of the time. Traditionally, cameras used to weight things very heavily in the center because they didn't have this fancy 256 segment metering system. They just kind of measure it in one area, and it was highly concentrated towards the middle. And so if you like that traditional metering system, it is available. If you want to be more specific, a very good option for some people is going to be the spot metering system. This allows you to be very precise about a small area. So if you're trying to read the light on a small area, you can do it with the spot meter. And yes, before you ask, you can link it to a focusing point. I'll show you that later on in the class. And then finally, there is an average, which just takes an even reading over the entire area. And you might find in some unusual situations that that does a better job of giving you a correct exposure. I'm not sure what those circumstances are going to be that it's going to be better than multi, but if for some reason multi is giving you a goofed up reading, maybe because there's a small singularly bright light that is throwing off your light meter or something, the average may not take it into account in the same way that multi does. But I think multi is going to work best for most people, spot for an occasion for some people, and average as well as an occasion for some special situations. All right, next up, the histogram. One of the best ways for really checking on a technical level if you have got the right exposure is by checking the histogram. This is a graph of the tonal distribution, and you can see whether your subject is underexposed or overexposed by just looking at the shape of this graph. I think histograms might replace traditional light meters at some point. I think they give us much more information. Rather than summarizing everything into just one single point of information, this gives you a whole shape, which lets you see how bright are the brightest areas and how dark are the darkest areas. Now, if you're pressing the display button on your camera and it's not working, that's because it's not turned on automatically, and we have to go in to the setup menu and turn this on. And I'm going to take the time to show you how that is done. So I want to be able to see the histogram on my camera. And if I press the display button now, yes, it does change the display. And yes, it does give me a histogram up here when the image is not on there. And that's nice and all, but I would like to see it with the image itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive into the menu, and we're going to work our way down to the wrench menu, which is the setup menu. And we want to go into screen setup options, which we're going to go to the right here. And there are 4 pages, and we're going to go quickly down to page 3. Display Custom Setting. Now this is going to give us custom options on all the things that we see in the display button. We go to the right, and if we come down to histogram, we can see that it is unchecked. So we're going to hit the OK button, and now we can back out of this, and we can press down halfway on the shutter release, and we can get back, and boom, there it is. So when we press our display button, we can either get our straight image, our information, which has our histogram there as well, and now we can see our histogram. So if I was to change my shutter speeds, you can see what it looks like when it gets darker and when it gets lighter. And when most of that information is towards the middle, let's change this to T. And as we change, I could see that better, 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 and then it's starting to get a little too bright there. So probably the right shutter speed that's getting me the most information in here is around a 30th of a second. And so we can adjust and tweak this exactly looking at that histogram in there, which I think is very, very helpful, especially in tricky lighting situations. All right, something that's very important we'll talk about a couple of times in this class is the exposure preview option. When I was doing my manual exposure, one of the things that we were doing is just looking at how bright the image is on the screen. As you're adjusting shutter speeds, you will see the exposure indicator over on the left changing. Brighter exposure, lower exposure, but you'll also see the image of your subject getting brighter and darker. And that's a pretty good way. It's not the best way, but it's a pretty good way of getting a quick general look of what your subject's going to look like exposure-wise in the end. Now, this is not going to work out in certain situations, like if you're in a studio using flash. You want to be able to see your subject all the time. So you can turn this exposure preview off by diving in to the menu system. This is going to be good, as I say, when you're using flash, and it might be good at some other times where you don't want to see the exact result that you're going to be getting. You need to have a good, clear view of your particular subject, in which case you're going to be looking just at the exposure indicator, not the brightness of the image itself. And so this is something I think most people would be best to leave on with the preview exposure and white balance, which means you're getting a preview of both the exposure and how the white balance is going to look in your final photograph. But in special situations, you may want to turn this off. And to turn it off, you need to dive into the setup menu under the screen setup option, page 2 in there, and there's an option for turning the preview exposure on and off. And so I'm going to leave it turned on right now. I think most people should leave it turned on, but it's important to know how to turn that off if you need to. All right, another tool on the camera, a button on the back called AEL, stands for Auto Exposure Lock. And this is where you can lock an automatic exposure in so that you can recompose the camera to get the shot with the correct shutter speed that you want. And there are two different options on the way that this works. Normally it works as a button press, which means you have to be pressing on the button for it to work. You can also have it work kind of like a light switch where you just press it once, it turns it on, and then you press it again to turn it off. Let's go ahead and do a little demonstration on this one. In this particular case, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be leaving the shutter speeds in automatic because this button only works when something is in automatic. We're going to zoom in a little bit more closely in here. And let's just look at what the camera is recommending for us. We are at f8 at ISO 800, and the camera is recommending a 60th of a second. It gets a 50th over here, but let's go way over here where I know it's darker. It's recommending a 13th of a second. If we said we really want to hold that in, we can press the AEL button, lock that in. We got to leave our finger on it, otherwise it resets. And so we're going to come back over here. We're going to hold it in, and then we're going to come back over and press down on the shutter release to take a photo. Now, that didn't look so good there in that particular example. It might work a little bit better if you were photographing somebody by a window, and the window is throwing off your exposure, so you point your camera off to the side, inside where the person is, lock the exposure on them, and then recompose so that your subject, the person, is properly exposed in the window. Well, that's going to look a little bit brighter than average, but you're getting the exposure right for the subject that's most important. And so exposure lock is something that some people use. Some people, like myself, I don't use it very much because I use manual exposure a lot. And I don't use that technique. And that button becomes then an available button for becoming what's known as a function button. This is something that we're going to talk a lot about as we go throughout the remainder of this class, is there are a number of buttons that you can reprogram to do whatever it is you want. If you want that button to become your self-timer button or your focusing button, you can have it do that by reprogramming that mode. And so that'll be a handy feature and something, as I say, we're going to talk a lot more about later on in this class. Another tool for getting the right exposure is exposure bracketing. So you're going to shoot a number of photos at different exposures to make sure that you are getting and coming home with the correct exposure. Now, there's a couple reasons for doing this. One is just tricky lighting and you want to cover your bases and make sure you get the right exposure. Also, HDR photography, where you are going to be using a number of photographs to compile them in a post-production program so that you can retain the information in the highlights as well as the shadows all in one particular photograph. Now, this is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about as well when we get into the drive settings, because it is controlled by the drive dial on this camera. So you can dial that over to the drive setting for bracket BKT, and then by pressing the button on the front of the camera, you can go in and set the particulars on it. So the particulars on this start with the frames and the step settings. So you can choose anywhere from 2 to 9 frames. Traditionally, bracketing was always 3 frames. You shoot what you think is normal, 1 lighter and 1 darker. I like doing 5 if it's a pretty serious situation because that really covers you. But some people who are doing HDR will go up to 9 frames in that regard. You can also choose to shoot in third stops, which really isn't all that much. Usually I shoot in 1 stops. I think that's going to give you a little bit better reach on getting all those highlights and shadows, but you can set it to whatever settings you need in there for that. You can also shoot in 1 frame or continuous. I like shooting in continuous because all of these images are generally kind of the same thing, and you can't really shoot these things of moving things, but you're trying to get them all shot in the shortest period of time so that they have the exact same lighting. Don't want to shoot 1 frame every 10 minutes, for instance, in most cases. Now, you might want to shoot 1 frame at a time if you're timing something particular that's going on, but I think in general, continuous is a good option here because when you press down on the shutter release, it fires through the whole bracket series and then stops. And then finally, you have some control over the sequence. Normally, the camera shoots the normal exposure first and then either the light or dark ones, which is a little awkward when you get to a full page of a whole bunch of bracketed shots. It's hard to tell where one begins and one ends. And so a lot of photographers like shooting the darkest first to the lightest or the reverse of that. It makes it a little bit easier to follow once you're done shooting and you're reviewing images on your computer later on. So let's go ahead and get that set up real quick and we'll do a little example here. So for bracketing shooting, let's go ahead and get our camera turned on. And what we want to do here is going to move our drive dial over to bracketing. And on the front of the camera is a button that I'm going to be pressing in here. You're not going to see it too well because it's on the other side of the camera. But when I press in on that button, it really just quickly pops me into the menu for frames and steps. And so let's say I want to do 5 frames at 1 stop increment. That's what I like to do. You can actually see down along the bottom of the frame what that looks like when you do more or less and how much coverage you're going to get. And 1 frame or continuous, as I said, I like continuous, we'll do that. I don't want to shoot the normal one first. I want to shoot the darkest one first up to the brightest one, so it's all in order right there. All right, so what's going to happen is we'll see over here on the left-hand side of the frame, you can see little notch marks by the, let's adjust this, maybe you can see it a little bit more easily there. You can see 5 little notch marks by the exposure indicator. And this is going to go somewhat quickly, but I'm going to press down and it's going to shoot 5 photos and then we'll review them. All right, like I said, it's going to go quickly. It's storing the images with a little light up here. It's letting us know it's storing those images. We're going to press playback. This goes to the most recent of the images, which is the bright one. Let's go. This is number 5, number 4, number 3, number 2, number 1. And so we can see at the bottom, -2 is our darkest one first, and then -1. This is our normal exposure, our +1, and our +2. All right. And so I've got my bracket series, and I know that I'm walking away with all the tones covered, you might say. And then I am going to flip it out of the bracket mode because I don't want to do that if I don't intend to do it. So once again, turning that one off when you're done is very important. Now, these controls, there's more of these things that you can control in here with the bracket setting, and we're going to talk more about that in the shooting setting menu later on in this class. All right, this camera does have a high dynamic range option on that mode dial that you can go to. And it has different options as to how much area it's trying to cover. Now, this is not going to work with raw images. I mean, you can have the camera in RAW and use it, but it's not doing anything to help you out. And so this is for somebody who wants to shoot JPEG, but they want to cover a wider dynamic range. I don't know that this is the best option, but it is an option. So I will tell you how this option works. So once you are in here, you can shoot a normal JPEG if you want. You can set it to 200, 400, 800, or 800 plus. Now, my test on this did not yield very, exciting or different results. Now, the 800 plus, I'm able to see into the shadow areas a little bit more clearly. Now, when I look at the histograms, I can start to see technically more about what's going on. And the camera is holding back those highlights a little bit more in each of the levels as you go higher and higher. It becomes very noticeable when it comes to 800 plus. You can see it's really pulling those highlights back. If we look at the shadow areas, there's not too much difference at first, but then it does start to really brighten those shadows up. And so if you had a very wide-ranging situation with light, from lights to darks, you had to shoot in JPEG or you wanted to shoot in JPEG for whatever reason, then yes, you can get a little bit more information straight out of that JPEG, a little bit more shadows, a little bit more highlight information by putting it into the HDR mode. Now, you could also take a JPEG and you could just mess with it, adjust it, improve it in some sort of post-production program by raising the shadows and pulling the highlights back, and you get a pretty similar result. And so the only reason for shooting the HDR, in my opinion, is if you need to get it straight out of camera and you don't want to mess with it later on. Now, just in case you're wondering, what if you shoot RAW? You're going to have way more control over things. You're going to have a lot more shadows that you can raise up. You're going to have more control over those highlights, but it is going to require you to shoot a RAW, and it's going to require you to download it, work with it in a post-production program, and adjust it there. And so if you just want it one shot out of the camera, straight, HDR works, it's just not real powerful in my opinion. Now, the other problem with the HDR is that it's trying to accommodate for people that are going to be hand-holding their camera, which you shouldn't be doing when you're in HDR, but this camera will allow you to do it. It crops in because when you're hand-holding, you're going to move the camera, and the 3 images that it shoots needs to be aligned, and so it overshoots, crops in so that it has a little bit of room to adjust and compile those images together. So you're going to lose some of your wide angle capability. Another not so great feature about this particular feature, but hey, it's there and it's useful for some people in some special situations. All right, now that takes care of most of all the exposure, but there's a lot of other things that control the look of images, perhaps more so on Fujifilm than any other brand of cameras. And so there's a lot of other concepts and ways to control your image that we're going to be talking about in section 12. And that's because this camera is so good at shooting JPEGs, there's a lot of control that you have over that. And so we're going to be diving more deeply into that in section 12. But there you go, folks. Those are your exposure controls on this incredible camera. Hopefully you figured out a few ways that you're going to want to work with the camera. There's probably a few that you don't need to. Nobody needs to use everything on the camera, but there should be more than enough options to fulfill pretty much anyone's needs.